Hello, welcome everyone to our webinar that's offered jointly by the Mobilize Center and Restore Center at Stanford University. My name is Jen Hicks. I'm the Associate Director for our centers and I'll be serving as the moderator for today's webinar. I'm pleased to welcome today's presenter, who's Lukasz Kidzinski, and our webinar today will come in two parts. First, we will have a research overview on quantitative movement analysis using single camera videos, and then this will be followed by a hands-on tutorial. So today's webinar series is brought to you by the Mobilize Center and Restore Center, which are both supported by the National Institutes of Health. The Mobilize Center is focused on developing and disseminating state-of-the-art biomechanics and machine learning tools for researchers to analyze human movement. The Restore Center is working to make these tools and other tools more widely accessible to the rehab research community. Before we get started, a couple quick reminders about the format of the webinar. We'll have a research talk and then a tutorial, and we'd love to take your questions. And we'll take some questions both at the end of the research talk and at the end of the tutorial. And we ask that you type those into the Q&A panel in Zoom. So not the chat, the Q&A panel. So now I'd like to go ahead and introduce our speaker for today. So Lukasz Kidzinski is a research associate in the Neuromuscular Biomechanics Lab at Stanford University. He's working to apply state-of-the-art computer vision and reinforcement learning algorithms to improve clinical decisions and treatment. Previously, he was a researcher at the EPFL in Switzerland, where he was developing methods to improve engagement in massive online open courses. He's also been a leader in bringing machine learning approaches to biomechanics, for example, by helping to launch a biomechanics challenge at one of the biggest computer science conferences. So with that, I'm very excited to have Lukasz and all of you joining us today, and I'll let him go ahead and take over and start the research talk.
Perfect. Thank you very much for the introduction and the invitation to give this first inaugurational webinar. That's a big responsibility, but hopefully I'll try to keep it as engaging as possible as we can do it for Zoom on Zoom. Great. So let me jump right off to the topic. I will be talking about how we can quantify human movement and analyze human movement using state-of-the-art and deep learning, machine learning, and AI methods. But let's start off, let's take a step back and think why we actually want to quantify movement and why we analyze movement. And at Stanford, in recent studies, we've been interested in many different populations, but I have three examples of who we may be trying to help with those methods. So first, there's elderly population with patients and subjects with osteoarthritis and other orthopedic disorders or neurological disorders such as Parkinson's disease, Alzheimer's disease, and all those have symptoms in movement and in gait. We have pediatric population of children with cerebral palsy and other neurological and orthopedic disorders. We have people who rely in their lives on medical devices and assistive devices, prosthetics, and again, we would like to help them too. And what is common for all those three populations is that they all rely on some treatments and surgeries and that we need to choose parameters for. And we cannot just choose parameters just by looking at the subject and deciding how much muscle we should lengthen or what should be the parameters of this prosthesis. Instead, we would like to have a quantitative and scientific method to assess those parameters and choose the best treatment for a given patient. In particular, we were interested in the population of children with cerebral palsy. That's in collaboration with Gillette Children's Specialty Healthcare. And here you can see one subject from this hospital. If you're a trained orthopedic surgeon, you will see that they have quite common patterns in their movement. So the gait is asymmetric. The child lands on his toes, and they walk in a so-called crouch. Their knees are overly flexed. And those are all symptoms of cerebral palsy. And you kind of may even have an idea on what kind of treatments you should prescribe, but still to get the best outcome of the treatment, you would like to get more quantitative data as a doctor. So what normally happens with a subject like this is that they are asked to go to a so-called gait laboratory where a physical therapist and an engineer put markers on the lower limbs of this child. They ask them to walk across the room filled with those high frequency, expensive cameras on the top. Those cameras are recording positions of those reflective markers that you see on the lower limbs. They record them in 2D. Each camera is in 2D, but then since you have a lot of those cameras, you can reconstruct 3D positions of those markers. So your raw data can be visualized like this. You have clouds of those white reflective markers moving in space. That's the only thing those cameras see. And now, since you have multiple of those markers on hips, on tibia, on femurs, you can see relative positions of those clouds of markers on the rigid bodies. So now if you have a relative position of the tibia and the femur, you can read a joint angle in the knee, which is one of the parameters that you're interested in while choosing the treatment. So the entire workflow looks like this. You have reflective markers on the body of the subject. You have high frequency, high resolution cameras finding those markers. Then an engineer finds a curve that tries to interpolate the observations. So what happens is that there are some occlusions. You will miss some observations. You want to find a continuous curve that goes through all those points that you found. You take anthropometric measurements of limbs of the subject. A physical therapist normally does that. With all this data, you put that into a computational model that gives you those joint angles that I was describing in the hip, in the knee. And now you put those joint angles in another system, and a engineer is finding so-called gait events or landmarks of the foot strike event to segment the time series into those so-called gait cycles. And you do that in order to make the curves comparable across subjects, to see the peaks in the right place and to see if there's some abnormality. Then an expert takes all this data and generates a report. So as you can see, it's a very sophisticated process that gives you very high fidelity data, and it's used extensively in gait analysis. But the problem is that it's sophisticated, but also very complex. So it's expensive and inconvenient. It takes around 30 minutes to set up the system and to put those markers on the body of the child. If you have if you have children, you know that that's not an easy task to put to glue something to your child. That takes even more time than 30 minutes. Even putting their shoes is sometimes difficult. The equipment is expensive. So those cameras I was mentioning, that they're expensive, but it actually can cost around $100,000. So not every hospital can afford that. You need a trained personnel. You need a physical therapist. You need an engineer. You need a medical personnel knowing how to use this quantitative data. You need a person to visit the clinic. That's kind of obvious, but since this systems are scarce in the US and definitely across the world, not everyone can actually, it's not viable for everyone to come to the clinic. You need space in the hospital. For hospitals, that's a scarce resource, an expensive resource. They could put beds in the hospital and make more money on that. So even from economical perspective, that's not something that you may want to do. There are scheduling issues. You cannot have two patients at the same time. There's scarcity of all those resources, and processing takes time for an engineer. So that's, again, expensive. So that's all something that we would like to fix, so to make the gait analysis accessible for everyone, because now you cannot track your patient after surgery because it's just too expensive. So the question where we were interested in, after seeing some of the recent results in deep learning and in computer vision, is whether joint pose estimation algorithms that I will be showing you in a second are already good enough for getting data that is useful for downstream analysis. So can we use deep learning to actually derive these reports for clinicians and skip all those expensive and complex steps that I was showing? The other question was whether we can predict a change in time. So if we have a system that can get some metrics, can we actually reliably use it for tracking a patient after surgery without having them visit the clinic? And finally, we want to check whether we can predict who will receive a surgery. That's useful for screening, for example, when a mom, the ideal scenario is where a parent, a mom or a dad takes a video of a child and presses a button and sees whether they should go to a hospital or they should try something first at home or something like this. So how did we solve this problem? How did we approach this problem? We build a much simpler workflow which doesn't rely on those reflective markers. You simply need to record your subject with the camera. You run an off-the-shelf key point detection algorithm that gives you those virtual markers on every frame of the video. And now, since you have those markers for every frame of the video, you have a time series of those positions that you can see here on the image. We want to throw them into some algorithm that will output a report without any human supervision, ideally. And with this approach, we're quite successful. We recently published that in Nature Communications, so you can see the whole paper. And here I will show you some of the key highlights of the paper. So first of all, this first part of the workflow is already solved to some extent, like this open pose algorithm, and there are a few other algorithms that can do that for us, so we will take it for granted. And what we are trying to solve is to find this neural network that generates a report. So let's see how we can perform. So first part, I'm saying it's solved. Let me show you how this key point detection algorithms actually perform. So for the video that I showed you at the beginning, you see that those key points are detected with reasonably high fidelity. There's some noise, there are some occlusions, there are some other subjects in the background, but overall this looks quite well. And with some denoising that I will show in the second part of the webinar, we can do quite well. And what's interesting is also that for pathological gait, it also performs well. So those methods are very robust to the data that you put as input. So we were quite hopeful while seeing that, and let's see how that can perform in the downstream analysis. So for the downstream analysis, we need a data set to train our machine learning model on. For that, we got 1,800 videos from Gillette Children's Hospital of subjects walking from right to left and left to right, and we had optical motion capture associated with each trial. So we got also ground truth for every trial that we wanted to predict from the video. The way we were approaching the prediction problem is that we ran this off-the-shelf key point detection algorithm first to get those key points. So this we take for granted, as I was saying. This the output, that's a visual way to show the output, but what's more interesting from the analytics perspective is that we have an XY position of every key point over all frames. So this is a long time series that we can put into a neural network, and that we have for all key points that we are interested in. And we know final output variables for the videos that we have in the training set. So with the output and input, we can train parameters of the network and get some accuracy. And the question is how good the network will be. But we have all the pieces required for finding the best function from our X to our Y. And now for a new video, when we have a new subject and we don't know the output variables, we'll just run open pose, we'll derive the same time series, we'll put that into a neural network, and the neural network will now predict those variables that we're interested in. How does that perform? We were interested in several gait metrics that are commonly used in practice. So first is the peak knee flexion. Knee flexion is the angle in the knee that we could potentially derive directly from open pose by just looking at the angle here between those two bones. But if we do that and correlate that with the metric from motion capture, we get actually correlation quite low of 0.51. Now, if we use our deep learning approach with training a neural network in between, we get a correlation of 0.83. So here we have predicted values from our network, true values from the ground truth values, and you see that the model actually performs. The predictions are quite good with correlation 0.83. We tried that for other metrics, for Gait Deviation Index, which is a holistic measure of gait abnormalities. And we got correlation of 0.75, which we show in the paper is actually quite close to what we would need to make it clinically relevant. Now, a common criticism of neural networks like this is that those are just black box approaches and we cannot really understand what is happening there. And while that might be true for those millions of parameters that we're training in the network, the model itself, the output of the training, the model that we are using, we can query it in different ways to understand what is happening there. And here's an example of how we investigate properties of our network. We're interested whether our network could be improved by adding some additional information from the frontal plane. So for the training of the network, we only use the sagittal plane, while in the frontal plane, we have a foot progression angle, the angle in the ankle, that could potentially be useful for predicting GDI. And indeed, we found that if we try to predict residuals of our model, so the part of that our model wasn't able to predict, and we correlate it with the foot progression, we find some relation saying that our model could be improved if only we had this extra information from the sagittal plane. So it is a black box model, but then we can query it in a way to see what to do to make it better. Now, a few questions that we're interested in. The second question that we're interested in is whether this model is useful in practice for tracking a patient after surgery, which is now too expensive to do with classical methods. And indeed, it seems that if we have the metric at the last visit in the hospital, and we have a video from a year later, we can predict the change in some of the parameters here, knee flexion parameter, with very high accuracy. Now, the final question that we were investigating is whether we can predict if someone should get a surgery or not. And for that, we had a data set. We had information of whether a subject received a surgery after the visit after a visit in the clinic. And we were trying to predict this binary variable, surgery or not, just from the video at this last visit in the surgery in the clinic. And we see that the AUC, so which is a metric of for measuring performance of those binary models, is reasonably good. So it's 0.71, showing that there is some signal in the video saying whether a subject should get a surgery or not. So that's not a production ready model yet, but like it shows that there's a meaningful direction to follow. So what are the key takeaways and next steps from what we've done so far? So first, we've validated that those deep learning models already have clinical importance, so that if we spend some extra resources on that, maybe for commercializing those efforts or just for making them more clinically relevant, it is a direction worth pursuing. This will only get better and better, but it's already at the point that that's useful. We showed it on cerebral palsy population, but we have no doubt that similar methods could be applicable to other disorders or other populations. And we just require more data for that. And that also is linked to our next steps. So for next steps of these projects, we're interested in two directions. How can we show that this is actually really already useful in practice by deploying those tools in the wild? And that's what we are actively pursuing. And the other direction is, can we build similar models with smaller data set, maybe relaxing the assumption that we have only one camera. Maybe we could use two cameras and get much better models with smaller data sets to make it more accessible for other researchers and other clinical scenarios. So that's it for our research part based on our paper. I'll be happy to take questions. So let me just tell at the end, sorry, forgot to acknowledge the key contributors to this paper. So Brian Young was a master's student in our lab that made majority of the deep learning work in this project. Jen Hicks, Apurva Gopal are our lab mates who helped a lot. Scott Delp is the PI in the lab, and Michael Schwartz had tremendous input on both the methodological side and collected all those videos over the last 30 years in Gillette Children's Hospital in a very controlled way that allowed running this study. Yeah.
Great, thank you so much, Lukasz, for the super clear talk. Now we'll go ahead and start the Q&A session. So again, if you have a question, please go ahead and type that in the Q&A panel, not the chat, and we'll get to as many questions as we can. We'll take 5 or 10 minutes of questions, and then we'll switch over to the hands-on tutorial. So going to the questions that have already come in, one from Xavier Schelling. Does the system work with movements other than walking? So jumps or a change of direction, things like that.
Mm, so the first part of the algorithm, the key point detection, would work with any movement. And for that, we would get time series of joints or key points in the body that we could process with some direct computational signal processing or deep learning. The network that we trained was explicitly for cerebral palsy, for a very controlled walking over 10 meters, 3 meters from the camera. So yes and no. Like the first part, yes. The second part would need to be retrained for your application.
Got it. Thank you, Lukasz. Another question you touched on a little bit already. This is from Faria Aurelio. Might you get better results if you had more cameras to record the movement?
Yes, that definitely we would have. Like that's what we showed in the paper in the on one of the slides, that if we had data on foot progression angle, which is the angle visible mainly from the frontal plane, our model could have been improved, and with other information from the frontal plane for sure. Now there's also another twist here. If we had many more cameras, like 3 or 4 cameras, we could potentially reconstruct 3D kinematics from those videos, and just use regular pipelines as they are used with optical motion capture. And in this case, we wouldn't even need the second step of the neural network for denoising the data.
Great, thank you. Let's see. Has there been any research combining marker-based and marker-less mocap techniques? For example, you track some positions with markers and some within the same patient. That's from Bram Van den Bosch.
That's very interesting. So indeed, like, as I understand, one reason for doing that would be to just really get even better predictions or estimation of the points. Optical motion captures are considered as ground truth, but there are some errors. So hopefully we could denoise them even further. If we used both signals, we could even use IMUs to get some dynamics. So there are ways to extend it. If the task is to get as precise measurements as possible, that could be one way to go. And there are groups that collect data on videos, IMUs, and optical motion capture. Annie Khalila from CMU is actually collecting a great data set on that. So I believe that is a direction right now being pursued by some groups.
Great. Now a question from Walner Pessoa. Have you done any studies or experimentation with generative adversarial network scan models with the data?
In this case, we haven't. So that would be definitely for a follow-up study when we want to deploy that model in practice. It would be great to use this kind of techniques for making it more robust. In this study, we didn't really care that much about building as robust model as possible. We wanted to run a proof of concept study. So it wasn't that important, but like I think it's, again, like for bringing it even closer to practical application, that would be one way to go.
Great. There was another question came up about whether we've published, and we have, and I think we'll send out a follow-up email that will have a link to the publication, for example, that you all could see. Let's see a question from Fabian Horst. Did you try to predict the time continuous waveforms for the whole gait cycle?
Yes, so we are actually doing it right now. So from OpenPose and our other key point detection algorithms, we only get projections, which are not that explicitly relevant for existing workflows. We would like to get precise 3D measurements, and we're investigating how well we can do with one or more cameras. That's a proof of concept work, but like I would be happy to discuss that if other people are interested.
All right. Let's see. Oh, sorry, the questions are moving around here. So from Bardia Akbari says, fantastic work. 2 questions. First, are you detecting the knee side, whether it's left or right, manually, or does this come from OpenPose?
From OpenPose, we get the, right, like, yeah, from OpenPose, we get the side of the body. So we need to know if this is a right or left knee. So yes, that comes directly from OpenPose.
Okay, And then have you tried using depth sensors in addition to RGB videos as well?
Right, that's an interesting question, because on one hand, we wanted to avoid adding expensive hardware. Like, it's not an expensive hardware, but extra hardware. Here we have just a mobile phone based system, and that was the objective. Now, on the other hand, there are new iPhones equipped with depth sensors. So as soon as this becomes a commodity, definitely that should be used for improving those systems. So we haven't tried because we didn't expect that to happen, but like now, that seems to be a good direction to go.
Okay, now a question from Ratula Chandrasekhan. Is the pediatric data set available for research? Or what are available, if any?
Right, so we have, since it's patients' data, and that spans over 30 years, some patients, like, we couldn't even track them back, so we couldn't get consent for releasing the actual videos. But we can, and we did release the key points derived from OpenPose, which were sufficient for running our downstream analysis and potentially could be useful for your research. So some of that is available, and we'll also share links to
that. So this question we've touched on it a little more, but I see some likes. People have given it a thumbs up, so I'll ask again. This is from Miguel Tavares da Silva. And can you further explain how to integrate a second camera?
Right, so there are two paths, and we are actually actively exploring both. So one is mainly this one of those we are exploring, but like one is to collect the data from two cameras and train a network as we are doing now. So we have, in the current version, we have just a bunch of time series from one view, but we could have other time series from the second view and throw that all into a neural network and predict the outcome. That would require still a lot of data to train this neural network model as we have now. But the other approach is to try to derive 3D kinematics from two cameras. And we are now trying to find out how accurate that can be. And even if it's not as accurate as optical motion capture, maybe it's good enough for being denoised with neural networks, so that with a smaller data set, we'll perform a similar analysis like here. So hopefully, yeah, we can follow up on that soon with some first results.
Okay. Now a question from Richard Blythman. How do you pass the time series data into the neural network? Is each frame treated separately?
We used so-called convolutional neural networks, which basically take a matrix of observed time series. We have like 25, I don't remember exactly the number of time series that we had, but like we have n time series and 160 time points that we are using for training the network, and we use 1D convolutions. So we find optimal filters for the data that we have, and the training of the neural networks concerns basically finding those optimal parameters of filters. I think that's it is quite technical, so I would refer you to the paper where we try to explain it very precisely, actually, how we train those networks.
Right. Yeah, so we'll send out the link to the paper so you can see more details in the methods towards the end of the paper. Now another question from Xavier Schelling. What is currently the processing time? Is it possible to have any real-time feedback?
So we were not focusing on real time, since that's for our clinical application that wasn't that important, but there are no big obstacles actually to getting real-time feedback. So OpenPose runs at that point with good hardware, runs at around 30 frames per second. So that's real time. And then our network is even lighter than OpenPose. So it is like, if that's the objective for a certain application, that's completely doable.
Right. Although the things that you're currently predicting are sort of gait cycle metrics. So
that's right.
Collect a little data and update. So 30 frames per second on it would be plenty to do the current metrics.
Right. Right. And then after the gait cycle, we could return a metric on that gait cycle.
Let's see, we'll do maybe 2 more questions, and then I can also try to answer some of them typing during when we switch to the tutorial, since there's lots of great questions here. So now a question from Anderson Rabe. Was it a special camera with high resolution or just an ordinary camera?
So the videos that I showed you at the very beginning, that's exactly the type of video that we had. This is like from around 15 or 20 years ago. We had videos that are more recent.
Less than ordinary.
Right.
Lower resolution than your smartphone today.
Exactly. And we actually downsampled them even further because OpenPose works at the lower resolution. So that there's nothing special about those cameras.